I knew something was wrong the moment I logged into the HR portal and checked my pay stub. The number on the screen didn't just surprise me, it punched the air out of my lungs. My monthly salary had been slashed by nearly $2,000. No warning, no email, no note explaining the deduction. As my eyes tried to make sense of the numbers, the Zoom meeting started. The Monday finance call. And right on cue, Gary Lawman, our new CFO at Dalton and Bright, appeared, his voice smooth as ever. "We're streamlining operations to show initiative to the new board." Then he smiled. That smug, practiced kind of smile men like him wear when they think they've just made a smart move. I sat there, 4 months into chemotherapy, my thinning hair pulled neatly behind my ears, trying not to react. I didn't flinch, didn't let the fury touch my face. I stayed still, silent. Not out of fear, but out of something far colder. The kind of silence you learn after surviving enough storms. The kind you hold when you're inside an MRI machine, praying the scan doesn't find more shadows. Gary kept talking about cost efficiency and human capital alignment, throwing around buzzwords like he was on stage, not realizing that somewhere between his rehearsed lines, I'd just been quietly erased from the payroll's priority list. I glanced at the other faces in the meeting. No one said a word. No one looked at me. And in that moment, the most brutal truth wasn't that I'd been cut. It was that I'd become invisible. I'd been with Dalton and Bright for nearly 13 years, long before it went public, before the boardroom was filled with men in custom suits and digital dashboards. I helped this company survive the 2008 collapse. I rebuilt our internal audit systems after a near SEC disaster. I rewrote the compliance frameworks when no one else would. I didn't do it for applause. I did it because it was right. But no one remembers that when you're 57 and battling pancreatic cancer. In their eyes, I'd become a liability, a faded name in a budget column marked non-essential. And when I came back after my third round of chemo, still meeting deadlines, still fixing broken spreadsheets, they didn't call that strength. They called it unsustainable. I turned off my camera, muted my mic, leaned back and stared at the screen, at the cold new number on my paycheck. And I didn't cry. I didn't email HR. I didn't complain. I just sat there, and for the first time in weeks, I could actually hear my own heartbeat. And then, a thought surfaced. Calm, crystal clear. They think I'm weak. But they forgot one thing. I've never stopped watching. By Tuesday morning, the silence had taken on a new shape, sharper than rejection, colder than indifference. It wasn't that people were rude, not exactly. It was the way they avoided looking directly at me during meetings, the subtle shift in their tone when they said my name, and the way the air grew heavier whenever I stepped into the break room, as if I'd brought with me the shadow of something they didn't want to face. A younger analyst, Derek, I think, walked past my cubicle without a word, though just a few weeks earlier he had asked me nervously how to prepare a variance forecast. Now he was seated in the strategy pod, reviewing a report I had written myself, the cover page still bearing the formatting I'd designed during the pandemic when we were all working from home, trying to keep the wheels from falling off. From behind the glass, I could see them, him, Gary, and a new hire named Emily, discussing the numbers like they were their own. Gary caught my gaze through the window, offered a nod that was as hollow as it was dismissive, and turned back to his performance. He didn't invite me in. He didn't acknowledge that the model they were dissecting had taken me 2 quarters to refine. There were no thank yous, no references. Just that empty nod, the kind you give someone who's already halfway out the door but hasn't realized it yet. I smiled back, because that's what you do when you're not sure if you're still part of the room or already a memory inside it. I didn't stop walking. I didn't ask questions. But something inside me, the part that had once believed merit was louder than maneuvering, started to go quiet. Not broken, not gone, just still. That afternoon, my calendar pinged. The weekly financial strategy meeting I had led for over a year had been reassigned. No explanation, no transition meeting, not even a courtesy email. The invite was now under Emily's name, the same Emily who had once confused net income with revenue during onboarding and asked me, without shame, whether net working capital was that thing about debt. Her name was there. Mine was not. I clicked the guest list twice just to be sure. Nothing. I called IT. They told me it was part of a seating optimization. My desk had been relocated to the far corner of the 11th floor, right next to the supply closet and across from the printer, where the toner fumes filled the air by noon and the floor shook every time someone used the paper cutter. The corner desk I had once sat in, the one with the view of the city, the soft, natural light, and the quiet that helped me think, was now hers. When I came home that evening, my mother was asleep on the couch, her glucose monitor blinking red. The blankets had slipped from her legs, and her breathing was shallow, like she was dreaming of something too far away to reach. I tucked the blanket over her gently, placed a pillow under her knees, and sat beside her, staring at the glowing red numbers that had become part of our daily rhythm, just another reminder of how fragile the balance really was. I'd been covering most of her medication ever since Medicare rolled back her supplemental coverage. Each bottle, each refill, was a calculation. My reduced salary didn't just affect my retirement plans or grocery budget. It put her health, her very stability, on a threadbare line. That night, I stood at the kitchen counter, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and a collection of unopened insurance letters, trying to decide which one to open first, as if there might be one that said, "It's okay now. You've done enough." I picked up my phone, considered calling my father, but I didn't. He would have answered. He always did. But I already knew what he would say, that I should walk into that office and demand an explanation, that I should remind Gary who I am, that I should stop pretending silence is strength. But if I let him fix this, it wouldn't be my story anymore. And this pain, this slow, methodical erasure, it needed to be mine. Because if I let someone else carry it, I'd lose not only control, but the proof that I still mattered enough to fight. So instead, I folded the bills and placed them back into the drawer. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and thought about every moment in the past few weeks where I had been made smaller, deliberately, surgically, and without a trace of outward malice. They didn't scream, they didn't threaten, they just moved on without me. There's a cruelty in that kind of silence. It convinces you that your absence doesn't matter, that you were never essential to begin with. But they were wrong. And I was done pretending not to notice. By midweek, the company's silence had stretched beyond professional distance. It had started to seep into my bones, a quiet, steady erosion that made every hour at my desk feel like a slow unraveling. But what they didn't see, what they would never see, was that the real weight I carried didn't come from a missing paycheck or a stripped title. It came from home. When I opened the fridge that night, I wasn't thinking about strategy models or corporate realignments. I was counting prescription labels, comparing expiration dates, checking dosages, doing the mental math of what I could afford to refill before the next billing cycle. My mother's insulin, her blood pressure medication, the statins, the nebulizer cartridges, they weren't optional. They weren't negotiable. And they weren't cheap. She hadn't worked in years. After her second stroke, I moved her into my condo outside of Charlotte, gave up the second bedroom I'd converted into a home office, and turned it into a space where she could rest without climbing stairs or worrying about falling. At first, it was supposed to be temporary, a few months of support, physical therapy, maybe some hired help. But months turned to years, and insurance coverage turned into partial subsidies that barely covered the basics. So I did what any child of a sick parent does. I adjusted, I sacrificed, and I said yes to everything that meant she could breathe a little easier. And now, with my salary slashed and benefits uncertain, I had to sit at our kitchen table beneath the soft hum of a flickering overhead light, holding a bottle of glucose strips in one hand and my credit card statement in the other, wondering which one would break first. I had already cancelled the physical therapy sessions I started after my own diagnosis, trading them in for YouTube breathing exercises and quiet walks around the block, hoping the tightness in my chest was just exhaustion and not something worse. I stopped buying the good groceries, the kind with green labels and whole ingredients, and started stretching out cans and coupons. I avoided the doctor, even when my energy dipped below zero, because I couldn't bear the thought of more tests, more bills, or worse, more bad news. And yet, the company, my company, Dalton and Bright, the same one where I'd dedicated over a decade of my life, didn't even flinch. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask about my health, or hers. They didn't ask anything at all. I remember one night, vividly. My mother had fallen asleep on the couch watching an old cooking show she used to love before her speech started slurring and the words became too hard to form. Her monitor was blinking red again. Low glucose. I sat beside her with a blanket, tucked it around her shoulders, and stared at the numbers. They were always just on the edge. Like everything else in our life, that night, I found myself standing in the hallway, lights off, staring at the reflection of our living room in the darkened glass of the sliding door. I could see both of us, her curled up in a quilted cocoon of fatigue and me, standing motionless, afraid to breathe too loudly in case it reminded the world I was still here. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. I simply stood there. And in the silence, I realized something that stayed with me. It wasn't just the company that had started treating me like I didn't matter. I had started believing it too, because when you're no longer young, no longer the rising star, when you've passed 50 and you come back from sick leave with thinning hair and dark circles under your eyes, people stop seeing you as essential. They start talking around you. They ask younger employees for the same answers you used to give. They act like you're still part of the meeting, but somehow your name never makes it onto the calendar. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly. One responsibility reallocated, one meeting missed, one desk move, one nod instead of a greeting. And suddenly, you realize you're standing in a hallway of your own life, holding on to things no one else even remembers you built. But I remembered. I remembered every system I designed, every late-night report I submitted, every time I said yes when others stayed silent. And now, I was watching it all be handed to someone who didn't know what it took to hold it together. They thought I would crumble under the pressure, that I would slip away quietly, grateful just to be kept on payroll, too distracted by illness or age to see what they were doing. But they didn't know what pressure does to people like me. It doesn't crush us. It carves us. It sharpens us. And eventually, it teaches us how to carry more than anyone thought we could. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of late evening where the office had grown quiet enough for the hum of the vending machine to sound like a clock ticking in reverse. I had stayed behind, not because anyone had asked me to, but because old habits are hard to kill. I was finalizing an asset allocation report that I knew would never bear my name, and perhaps would never even be acknowledged. But I finished it anyway, because that's who I had always been: thorough, precise, invisible. As I gathered my things and turned toward the elevators, I noticed a soft glow coming from the hallway near the executive wing, Gary's office, door slightly ajar, lights still on. I didn't mean to stop, not really. I told myself I was just pausing, just checking if I had left anything behind. But something in the air felt off, tense, weighted, the way a storm feels just before it breaks. And then I heard my name. "She's not a risk," Gary was saying, his voice low, almost casual. "She's quiet. She won't push back. We can phase her out without much trouble." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood there, half shadowed by the flickering hallway light, and listened as the words kept coming. Clinical, strategic, gutting. "No husband, no mentor, no internal backing," he continued. "She's solo, not protected, and the new board wants efficiency, not sentiment." Another voice, someone from HR, I think, chimed in, laughing under their breath. Cold, but smart. They weren't wrong, at least not about the coldness. But the smart part, well, that's where they'd underestimated me. I leaned back against the wall, the cool plaster grounding me as the heat in my chest began to shift. No longer the ache of exhaustion or the dull sting of being overlooked, but something sharper, quieter, cleaner. This wasn't rage. It wasn't despair. It was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Clarity. Because that was the moment I stopped making excuses for them. I had spent the last several weeks trying to rationalize the demotion, the missing meetings, the sudden erasure of my role. I had told myself it was structural, that maybe it was about optics, that perhaps they just didn't know how much I still contributed, how much of the company's financial backbone had been built on frameworks I had quietly created and sustained. But now, hearing Gary's voice, steady, calculated, surgical, I understood. This wasn't ignorance. It was intention. I was being eliminated, not because I had failed, but because I made it easy for them to pretend I didn't matter. And maybe, in some ways, I had helped them do it, by staying silent, by showing up sick and smiling anyway, by working harder instead of pushing back, by never once calling in a favor or pulling on the thin thread of influence that ran quietly through my last name. A thread I had buried so deeply, most people at Dalton and Bright didn't even know I was the daughter of their retired co-founder. I hadn't wanted legacy. I had wanted merit. I thought I could earn my way through. But Gary wasn't looking for merit. He was looking for empty chairs, for silence that wouldn't scream, for targets that wouldn't fight. I left the hallway that night without making a sound. I didn't cry. I didn't send a single email. Instead, I walked 2 blocks to a diner that stayed open past midnight, sat in a corner booth with cracked leather and a flickering neon light in the window, and opened my laptop. I ordered coffee I wouldn't drink. I wrapped my coat tighter around my shoulders. And I began. Not out of vengeance, not out of pride, but out of something deeper, something older. The need to be seen, the need to make it undeniable. I traced every inconsistency Gary had ever left behind. The inflated travel budgets for junior hires, the shadow promotions with no performance reviews, the title changes that created loopholes in oversight, the spreadsheets that looked clean only because someone had moved the numbers just far enough to appear legitimate. I dug into archived memos, flagged discrepancies in expense reports, cross-checked budget justifications with hiring records. I used the same internal systems I had helped design to protect this company from waste, and now I turned them inward. I built my own audit, quiet, unapologetic, ruthless in its precision. And when I looked up, hours later, the sun had started to rise through the fog outside that diner window, colouring the world in soft shades of grey and steel. It looked just like the morning I'd first walked into Dalton and Bright all those years ago, clutching a leather folder and a silver pen with my initials engraved into the side, given to me by a father who told me, "Never wait for them to hand you a place. Build one, and then dare them to take it from you." That pen was still in my bag, and now I was ready to use it. Not to ask, not to beg, but to write the beginning of something they would never see coming. The following days passed in a haze of polite avoidance and carefully rehearsed indifference. Gary still walked by my desk with that practiced smirk, tossing out casual remarks like, "Busy week ahead, huh?" As though he hadn't spent the previous Thursday evening outlining my professional execution with HR behind a half-closed door. He acted as if I were none the wiser. Another name on a spreadsheet, too compliant to cause waves, too isolated to pose a threat. But what he didn't realize was that something had shifted, not just in how I saw him, but in how I saw myself. I no longer measured my value by the space I occupied or the meetings I was invited to. I no longer hoped for acknowledgement or clung to the illusion that quiet loyalty would earn respect. Instead, I began to observe, not with bitterness or vengeance, but with the cold clarity of someone who had nothing left to protect except the truth. Every interaction became data. Every internal announcement, every sudden title change, every budget request and expense memo. I traced them all. I downloaded reports late at night, pieced together timelines, and followed threads most people didn't even know existed. I used the same tools I had once created to safeguard Dalton and Bright's financial integrity, only now I turned them inward, mapping the rot that had taken root just beneath the polished surface of Gary's leadership. I remembered the way he slashed our department's travel allowance just weeks after approving a $16,000 conference trip for Emily, a junior marketing associate who had yet to lead a single initiative of her own. I found the purchase orders buried in the approval logs, labeled as strategic vendor outreach, even though the conference wasn't even in our sector. I compared that to the denial I received for a modest budget extension to maintain compliance software, something that could have protected the company from costly fines had anyone cared to look past the optics. It was all there, in black and white. I didn't need to embellish. I didn't need to spin. All I had to do was shine a light where they had assumed no one was watching. I flagged discrepancies in department-level budgets that mirrored each other suspiciously. I found positions with inflated titles and salaries that didn't align with job responsibilities, some of which had been created during the same month. Gary initiated his so-called restructuring plan. I followed the trail like breadcrumbs, not because I was out for blood, but because I was tired of pretending that silence meant submission. I compiled my findings into a report, not a rant, not an accusation, but a meticulous audit that outlined exactly where the money had gone, how policies had been manipulated, and which names kept appearing where they shouldn't. I used clean charts, pulled direct quotes from internal emails, and cited approval timestamps that would be impossible to refute. The document grew slide by slide, not with rage, but with resolve. I didn't write it to scream, I wrote it to endure. But I didn't send it, not yet. Because real power isn't about how quickly you strike, it's about when. Gary needed to feel safe. He needed to believe that his plan had worked, that I had folded neatly into the background, defeated, forgotten. He needed to let his guard down long enough for the truth to settle in before it struck. And so I waited, with my silver pen resting beside my keyboard, like a promise I wasn't ready to cash in just yet. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm. Some colleagues still avoided eye contact. Others offered strained encouragements that sounded more like condolences than support. A few parroted Gary's lines with perfect loyalty, perhaps unaware, or perhaps complicit. None of it surprised me anymore. I wasn't looking for allies. I wasn't interested in starting a firestorm or gathering a crowd. I was building something quieter, something stronger. I reviewed the executive summaries Gary submitted to the board and cross-referenced them with his public-facing statements during our quarterly meetings. I flagged subtle contradictions, delays rebranded as strategic pivots, cost reductions that were merely departmental shell games. I didn't need to shout that he was lying. I only needed to show the math. By Friday, I had created a 3-slide preview of the full report. Not enough to expose everything, but just enough to raise questions, just enough to signal that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. I addressed the email not to HR, not to Gary, but directly to the executive leadership team. I didn't include the full audit, only a taste. I signed it simply Mara Kellerman, Strategic Financial Advisor, Dalton and Bright. I hovered my finger over the send button for a moment, glanced at the silver pen resting beside my keyboard, the same one my father had given me when I started at the company 13 years ago, and remembered his words. Don't ask for space, earn it, then let them try to take it away. I pressed send, and just like that, the waiting began. Not with fear, not with anger, but with a stillness that comes only when you know exactly what's coming and exactly who you are when it arrives. The following Monday began like most others, with a quiet commute, a lukewarm coffee, and the mechanical sound of my keycard granting me access to a building that no longer saw me. I took my seat, still beside the supply closet, still beneath the flickering light panel no one had bothered to report, and turned on my monitor with the calm of someone who had already made peace with the war ahead. By 9:12 a.m., the reply arrived, a meeting invite from the executive office, subject line. Preliminary review, internal budget concerns, no agenda, no context. Just a name, a time, and 6 words that made my breath still in my chest. Your analysis caught our attention. I accepted without hesitation. At 10:03 a.m., Gary Lorman strode past my desk with his usual feigned casualness, tossing a comment over his shoulder about Q2 projections, as if nothing in his world had changed. And perhaps for him, it hadn't. Not yet. The meeting was held on the 35th floor, where the windows stretched from floor to ceiling and the walls whispered of privilege. It was a space I had entered only twice in 13 years, both times as a silent observer during earnings reviews. Today, I would not be silent. I arrived 2 minutes early, dressed in navy, structured, understated, deliberate. No makeup, no jewelry, no smile. I wasn't there to impress. I was there to clarify. The conference room was long and clinical, designed to intimidate, with chairs spaced just far enough apart to discourage familiarity. At the head of the table sat 2 executives I had only ever seen in quarterly reports, one flipping through the preview slides I had sent, the other with a legal pad and a pen that tapped rhythmically against the table's edge. "Mara Kellerman?" one of them asked, though he already knew. I nodded and took my seat, spine straight, hands folded, heart quiet. "We'd like you to walk us through this," the other said, gesturing toward the documents. "We want to understand what we're looking at." So I began. No drama, no accusations. Just numbers. Tracked, traced, verified. I explained how titles had been inflated to justify compensation adjustments, how department restructuring had conveniently shifted accountability, and how expense reports had been manipulated to disguise personal spending under operational codes. I detailed the discrepancies in travel budgets, the duplicated initiatives labeled as innovation, and the way certain hires had bypassed normal vetting entirely. When they asked where the data came from, I pointed to the internal systems I had helped build, the audit protocols, the expense validation layers, the very checks Gary had once praised before he learned how to bypass them. There was no anger in my voice, no condescension in my tone, just precision, just proof. At the end, I handed over a sealed envelope containing the full 22-page audit, signed and sourced. The room fell quiet as they flipped through the opening pages. Then one of them glanced up, pen paused. "Kellerman," he said slowly. "Any relation to Michael Kellerman?" I met his eyes, steady and unblinking. "That's not relevant to this conversation," I said, and it wasn't. He nodded. That was enough. As I left the room, I passed Gary in the hallway. He looked up from his phone, startled to see me stepping out of the executive wing. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for doubt to bloom. He didn't ask what I was doing there. He knew better. And still, I said nothing. Silence had become my sharpest tool. That afternoon, I received a short message from one of the executives. "Next steps under review. Please remain discreet." I smiled at the phrasing. Discreet had never been a problem. But I wasn't hiding anymore. I was preparing. By Wednesday, a second meeting appeared on my calendar. This one marked full committee review, with legal and compliance CC'd. Gary was not included. The morning arrived grey and hushed, as if the city itself had paused to watch what would unfold. I entered the boardroom at precisely 9:58 a.m., carrying only my notes and the same silver pen I had once clutched on my first day of work, a gift from a father who believed more in integrity than appearances. Gary was already there, seated uncomfortably close to the far end of the table, his posture rigid, his smile strained. "Didn't realize you'd be attending," he muttered. I said nothing and took my seat. One by one, the others filed in. Legal, compliance, 2 vice presidents. The chair at the head of the table remained empty until it didn't. The door opened one final time, and in stepped the man Gary had spent years trying to outperform, to impress, to replace in reputation and reach. Michael Kellerman. My father. No announcement, no ceremony, just presence. He nodded to the room and took his seat in silence. "Let her speak," he said, when Gary opened his mouth to interrupt. It wasn't a request, and so I spoke, line by line, number by number, decision by decision. I mapped the full cost of Gary's deception, over $1.2 million in misrepresented savings and internal manipulation. I offered no judgment. I didn't need to. The data spoke clearly. When I finished, Gary tried to laugh, a weak, panicked sound that didn't reach his eyes. "With all due respect, this feels more like a personal vendetta than an audit," he said. I turned to him then, for the first time in weeks, and looked him square in the eye. "I gave you the benefit of the doubt," I said quietly. "I thought maybe I was just collateral damage in a bigger picture. But then I heard what you said, about how I was easy to manage, how I had no one. That's when I stopped hoping for fairness and started documenting the truth." He turned toward my father, eyes wide. "This is obviously personal." But my father didn't flinch. "I wasn't even aware she submitted a report." he said flatly. And if I had been, I would have expected worse. Compliance cleared her throat and spoke with the finality of a verdict. We've verified her records. Internal counsel confirms the findings are accurate. The risk exposure is substantial and ongoing. Gary stood, fumbling for words. I think I should speak with my own legal team. You're free to do so, my father replied calmly. But as of this moment, your role as department head is suspended pending full investigation. Security will escort you from the premises. There was no shouting, no defense, just silence. The same silence he once mistook for my weakness. Now, it was his. They offered me a promotion the following week, title elevation, back pay, a newly refurbished corner office with a view that caught the sun just right at around 3 p.m. each afternoon. It came with a revised salary package, nearly double what Gary had once so casually taken from me without explanation or remorse. The message was clear. This was restitution, recognition, maybe even redemption, packaged neatly for public consumption. And yet, I declined. Not because I wasn't grateful, and not because I didn't believe I had earned it, but because I knew accepting would turn my survival into a storyline they could use, a symbol they could hold up and say, see, the system works. But it hadn't worked. I had. And I didn't want to be used as a case study in corporate reform, when what I had really done was survive a quiet war they pretended wasn't happening. So I stayed in my role, at the same desk, just outside the analytics pod. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I no longer needed symbols of power to know my worth. The room had changed. The silence had shifted. And I, who once felt invisible, was now the still point in a space that had finally begun to see. Colleagues who had once avoided eye contact now lingered at my desk to ask for guidance. Junior analysts who had once echoed Gary's lines now paused before making decisions, sometimes glancing in my direction for reassurance they never had the courage to request before. My name appeared on meeting invites again. Strategic sessions, budget forecasts, compliance reviews. But more than that, I noticed something else. People started saying, "Thank you," more often, not performatively, but with the soft sincerity that comes when someone realizes they almost lost something valuable and didn't even know it. And yet, the thing that lingered wasn't the fear or the fallout. It was something Gary had said in that hallway meeting, something I couldn't forget, no matter how much changed afterward. She's not protected. He wasn't wrong. For most of my career, I had gone to great lengths to separate myself from my father's name, believing that every accomplishment should be mine alone, that every opportunity should be earned the long way, without shortcuts, without shadows. I didn't want whispers about nepotism or back doors. I wanted respect, the kind built slowly and silently over time. And I had gotten it, eventually, but at a cost. In pushing so hard to stand alone, I had made it easy to be isolated. I had left no trace of backup, no trail of allies. I had survived, yes, but barely, and for far too long I did so in silence. That was the part I promised myself I would never let repeat. Not for me, and not for anyone else. So I began to do something that felt at once small and revolutionary. I started mentoring. Not with fanfare or formal programs, but with open doors and honest conversations. I invited 2 young women, both quiet, both brilliant, both easy to overlook, to shadow me during strategic sessions. I forwarded them praise I once would have kept for my own defense. I coached them through tough edits, invited their questions, and when they hesitated, I told them the truth. You are not too much. You are not too quiet. You are exactly what leadership looks like before the world decides it's ready to listen, because power doesn't always come from speaking the loudest. It often lives in those who listen the longest, observe the most, and only strike when they have something worth saying. I still keep the silver pen on my desk, not as a relic of the past or a reminder of who gave it to me, but because of what I used it for: documenting, protecting, and when the moment called for it, cutting through the noise with quiet precision. At home, I opened a new savings account dedicated to my mother's prescriptions. I paid off the outstanding balances and, for the first time in months, didn't have to check my banking app before walking into the pharmacy. We shared a quiet dinner that night. Nothing extravagant, just peace. And in a life that had forgotten what peace looked like, that meant more than any promotion ever could. Some people think revenge is fire and fury, raised voices and slammed doors. But I've learned that real justice often comes softly. It arrives in the sound of a report sliding across a conference table, in the hush that falls when data speaks louder than ego, and in the steady gaze of a woman who was once underestimated, now refusing to be erased. I never needed to shout, I just needed to stay. And now, when I see someone else shrinking in the shadows, afraid they've been forgotten, dismissed, or devalued, I don't wait for them to ask for help. I step forward, because the only thing more powerful than surviving the fire is helping someone else walk out of it too. Have you ever been overlooked, pushed aside, or told you no longer mattered, only to prove them wrong in your own quiet way? Tell me how you stayed. Tell me what they underestimated about you. Because these stories don't just belong to one of us, they belong to all of us. Share yours below. I'm listening.